Haruka Fujita from Kyoto University, and the topic of this talk is to define the protolanguage as lexical protolanguage, which had only lexical categories, and explain the emergence of modern human language with functional categories. And in this talk, I will propose a hypothesis that the three-stage evolution of human language. First of all, I'd like to start by giving an overview about the discussion of protolanguage. In evolutionary context, protolanguage means a precedent system for modern human language. And regarding what protolanguage is like, there are several opinions depending on some issues. And I pick up some issues here. And one is concerning its structure type. That is, whether protolanguage was compositional one or synthetic one, which was composed of several words, or holistic one that expressed the meaning in a single one-word-like expression. And another issue is its function. It's about whether the function of protolanguage was representational one, in the sense that it enabled the complex internal thought, or its function was communicative one, that it enabled effective communication. And if we think the main function of protolanguage was communication, a problem of monarchy will also arise. Then I clarify my standpoints among those issues. Regarding its structure, I assume that the protolanguage was compositional one, composed of some prototype words, because I think holistic view has some problems. One is that holistic view cannot clearly reveal the difference between protolanguage and other animal communications, because according to holistic view, protolanguage had a limited number of holistic expressions associated with frequent and shared situations. But animal communications also have such holistic expressions associated with frequent and shared situations. According to Ray, who is claimed the holistic view, he says that the difference between animal communications and protolanguage can be attributed to the expansion of inventory, but I think this is not the essential difference. Rather, I think that what makes protolanguage different from other animal communications is that it can introduce and incorporate new concepts other than those shared in pre-existing expressions. Thus, I consider that the compositional view is more critical and crucial to explain the emergence and development of protolanguage. And another reason is that it is uncertain that people at that time could have segmented sound and meaning properly from holistic forms, because they may not have had a clear phonological and semantic system like in the present day. And regarding function of protolanguage, I assume that the original function of protolanguage was a representational one for internal thought. The reason is that if there is no content to express and share in the first place, communication will not occur. In that sense, the starting point should have been an internal representation in private thought. However, considering that language is an important means of communication, at least in modern language, and that the meaning of words become clear by externalizing and sharing, it seems that communication could have been one of the important functions of protolanguage, but even though it was not primary one. Then let me move on to my proposal. In this talk, I will propose a hypothesis that protolanguage was composed of word-like elements that can be classified as lexical categories, without functional categories in the sense of generative grammar. I call this protolanguage as lexical protolanguage. Although Fitch also uses the term lexical protolanguage, and the notion is almost the same, but my lexical protolanguage is not identical to his term in 2 points. One is that I use the term lexical to emphasize that protolanguage had only lexical categories. And I also suppose that lexical protolanguage was equipped with some kind of syntax, even though it might have been a primitive one. And here I give a brief explanation about the notion of lexical categories and functional categories in generative grammar before getting to the detail of my lexical protolanguage hypothesis. In generative grammar, lexical categories are defined by the combination of category features N, approximately stand for noun, and the V approximately stands for verb. So lexical categories contain nouns, which is defined as plus N and minus V, and verbs defined as minus N and plus V, and adjectives or adverbs defined as plus N and plus V. Whether adpositions, which is defined as minus N minus V, are also included into lexical categories is controversial. But here I exclude adpositions from lexical categories. And the functional categories are defined as categories other than lexical categories. In fact, the idea that the protolanguage had only lexical categories is common. For example, based on generative grammar's analysis, Prokopov proposes a hypothesis that the first sentences were a paractic combination of noun and verb. And besides, from the standpoint of communicative function, Harford points out that the most basic communicatively functional distinction is between topic corresponding to noun and focus corresponding to verb. And in terms of grammaticalization, Heine and Kuteva argue that the nouns and verbs are evolutionary primitives, which are not derived from any other categories. Thus, from several viewpoints, including grammatical analysis or communicative perspectives, it is reasonable to suppose that protolanguage was composed of only lexical categories. Now note that lexical categories of lexical protolanguage were not the same as those of modern human language. I assume that the lexical categories of protolanguage were kind of primitive ones that were not separated from temporal spatial context, which can be expressed by elements such as tense or aspect in modern human language. Therefore, lexical protolanguage couldn't have expressed situations away from the here and now, and its interpretations was grounded in the pragmatically probable situations. Then the next question is how and why functional categories were separated and emerged. Here, I propose that it is important to notice that there are two types of functional categories. The first type is elements that denote the temporal spatial information and clarify the context and interpretation of prepositions. This temporal spatial information includes not only physical distance, but also more abstract concepts such as speaker's mental position to propositions. And I call this type of functional categories as contextual functional categories. This type of functional categories correspond to elements such as tense marker or aspect marker or demonstratives. And the second type is the elements that make little contribution to propositional contents or meanings, rather clarify the structural and interword relationships, which are often obscured by linearization. I call this type of functional categories as structural functional categories. This type of functional categories correspond to elements such as complementizer, case marker, or agreement marker, and so on. Now I propose that these functional categories have distinct adaptive functions and evolutionary process respectively. First is contextual functional categories. The emergence of contextual functional categories makes it possible to add the information detached from the here and now to propositional contents. Therefore, the adaptive function of contextual functional categories was to allow more creative expression that departed from the here and now and most probable interpretations. As I mentioned earlier, in lexical protolanguage, temporal spatial information was not separated from lexical categories. Rather, lexical categories of protolanguage included this information in the way that it was connected to what was going on around the agent. Thus, contextual functional categories have emerged by being separated or disintegrated from lexical categories in protolanguage. And then they have established as distinct elements. Of course, other animals and human beings at the time of protolanguage have the concepts detached from the here and now, but they don't have the way of expressing them. So to put it simple, my point is that what made it possible to express the displaced propositions and promote the more abstract thought was the emergence of contextual functional categories. This idea corresponds to the disintegration hypothesis proposed by Fujita. And regarding the evolutionary process of contextual functional categories, I suppose that it involves general cognitive ability of conceptualization and abstraction. Because the disintegration of contextual functional categories seems to be a kind of concept formation. Next is about structural functional categories. Structural or interword relationships in a certain expression are clear to the creator of that expression, since they are visible to the creator. However, once he or she externalizes this structure, those relationships can be ambiguous because the externalization and linearization could remove this information. You can see this in these structures in the slide. There are two structures of different meanings. One is the book is green and another is jacket is green. However, these structures have the same linear order when they are pronounced, and here the ambiguity will occur. So the role of structural functional categories is marking such information. Hence, they are elements that give a guide to complex relationships, rather than they are new concepts. So in short, the adaptive function of structural functional categories is to indicate the relationship that is clear in internalization, but can be ambiguous in externalization. To put it another way, their adaptive function is to improve effective communication. And given this, it is supposed that the structural functional categories have been developed at the request of communication after the linguistic structures have been established. Thus, the evolutionary process of them involves cultural factors, including the way of communication. In particular, I presume that the grammaticalization have played an important role. Now I briefly summarize my proposal. The proposal here is that modern human language have evolved from protolanguage in three stages. At the first stage, lexical protolanguage composed of only lexical categories have emerged. And the second stage, contextual functional categories were separated from lexical protolanguage, and this enabled the expression departed from the here and now. And at the same time, externalization and communication of linguistic structures have also developed. And due to this, to indicate the structure of interword relationships become adaptive, and structural functional categories have emerged. And these stages and the elements involved in each stage can be applied to the layers of grammatical development proposed by Heine and Kuteba. Applying my proposal to their layers, lexical categories of my lexical protolanguage stage correspond to layer 1 and 3, 2 and 3, indicated by blue letters. And the contextual functional categories correspond to the layer 4 and part of 5, indicated by green letters. And the structural functional categories correspond to the layer part of 5 and 6, indicated by orange letters. And let me talk about the prediction that can be derived from my proposal. The prediction is that structural functional categories are less expressed as morphemes compared to contextual functional categories. The reason is that according to theoretical linguistics, the internal linguistic structures are universal among languages, but their externalization form varies depending on languages. And as I explained, structural functional categories are adaptive in external communication. And cultural, that's okay to continue there. Okay. And cultural factors could affect them. So this prediction has come to bring about. And I verified the prediction by typological data, and this typological data supports this prediction. And that's all. Thank you for attention.